Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our May book club discussion of Coronation Year, which everyone has been so excited about. We're so excited that we have Jennifer Robson joining us tonight. And I am here in my fascinator with my gorgeous co-host, Brenda.
Who were not models, obviously. But hi, everybody.
We are so excited. We're having a little virtual tea party along with our book club discussion, but we don't want to keep you guys waiting anymore. So, Brenda, do you want to go ahead and introduce our special guest?
Oh, it would be my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest because we're so excited. Jennifer Robson is an academic by background, a former editor by profession, and a lifelong history nerd. She said herself. She's author of 7 novels set during and after the 2 world wars, Somewhere in France, After the War is Over, Moonlight over Paris, Good Night from London, The Gown, Our Darkest Night, and what we're talking about today, Coronation Year. She was also a contributor to the acclaimed anthology Fall of Poppies. She was born and raised in Peterborough, Ontario, studied French literature and modern history as an undergraduate, then attended St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford, which just made me just swoon, where she obtained her doctorate in British economic and social history. She lives in Toronto, Canada with her husband and children and shares her home office with Bonnie the sheepdog and feline companions Mika, Rachel, and Opie. So welcome to our book club and virtual tea tonight, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. To be honest, I can't believe I went to Oxford. It was so long ago, and it's kind of the stuff of dreams when I look back. I've visited a number of times. When I go back to England, I'll pop by my college, and I took my kids a few years ago, and they were like, oh yeah, that's cool. And I wanted to say, come on, guys, this is the coolest place. Like, aren't both of you seized with the urge to go here one day? And they were like, yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. So, I'm glad my children don't walk around being impressed by me. I think, my role at this point is to mortify them, not for them to look up at me. They can do that later.
Having just had Mother's Day, I think you're absolutely right.
Well, we're having go ahead, Brenda.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to say, before we get started, we should do a little toast with our tea. I don't have a proper teacup, but I do have a lovely bookish mug. So it's very American of me. Oh, you see,
and you know what? I didn't get the kettle boiling. So this is soda water. It's not vodka. Just as I said the other night in Friends of Fiction, I'm not chugging vodka or a clear tequila. No judgment. Not on a Monday.
You would have no judgment. No judgment at all. So we have tea here. Brenda, what kind of tea are you drinking?
Well, I am drinking, I have to look at the tag because my normal is Earl Grey, but this is Fortnum and Mason's Royal Blend for tonight.
No, you are not. Are you kidding me?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, you guys.
Yeah, I have some of that sitting at home too. In fact, well, it's so far over on my desk I can't reach it, but that's going out in a giveaway soon.
Patty Callahan gave us this. So I figured it'd be perfect tonight. It's like she said, Fortnum and Mason Royal Blend, and it's delicious. Jennifer, what's your favorite tea?
My favorite tea, and this actually, it's funny, I didn't start drinking coffee until I was through 9-10 years of university. It was crazy. How did I get through university without drinking coffee? But I remember, especially when I was in England, and this is before the kind of, this is 30 years ago, maybe almost 30 years ago. This is before coffee kind of took over everywhere, and especially in England, like you'd be really hard pressed to get a good cup of coffee anywhere except at an Italian restaurant. So I drank just tea, and my favorite thing was black tea with vanilla. And for whatever reason, if I brew a cup of that, that to me, I just think, oh, I'm right back. I'm right back to, you know, studying in where, you know, my one overriding memory of the years I lived in England, both in Oxford and other periods, is of being cold a lot, to be honest. I say that as a Canadian, but it was really cold in the winters, very damp. And so the tea was really great as a hand warmer, more than anything else.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I use
I can
that.
believe
That's why I
that.
use it
Yeah,
at
yeah,
work.
just to keep the hands warm. And it, whereas it's actually quite warm up in Toronto tonight, so I thought, you know what, I'm going to stick with some soda water, and that'll help with my throat. I've been talking so much in recent weeks that
Oh.
my voice starts to go after a while.
I wonder what about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, and there was
Hmm.
this big event the other weekend that, you know, had nothing to do with it. So,
Well, we
That's
do have an
funny.
advanced question from
oh,
a
for sure.
special member of the book club that I think you might know. Her name is Mary Kay Andrews. I'm not sure if you've heard of her.
My darling MKA. We all love her so much.
She wanted to ask you, what is your favorite treat for tea? And do you prefer sweet or savory?
Mm. Um, I'd have to say savory, funnily enough. You know, my favorite thing that I used to have, and is something really very much, I mean, I posted a recipe for sugar crusted scones, or scones, as my Scottish granny would say, just before the
Oh,
coronation. And those are just sensational. Like they're butter with just a tiny bit of flour holding them together, but it's basically just a wedge of butter in pastry form. Um, but the one thing that I associate with, like, you know, cold, rainy afternoons and sitting with a book are crumpets, which I don't think are super popular outside England. And they're just, you can make them yourself, but you can buy them in the grocery stores here for sure. And I toast them and toast them and toast them again. Like you have to have the crumpet has to be almost like really toasted. And then you put an unseemly amount of butter on the crumpet. And some people put jam, but I don't like it to be sweet. And that with a cup of tea is very restoring when it's cold and yucky outside, which it is in England from like November for about 4 or 5 months, I would say. Oh, maybe 4 months.
oh,
Yeah. Yeah. So well, yeah, I don't know. I would take snow over cold and rain any day. You know, I just on the other hand, you don't shovel rain. So that's, you know, that's an important that's another factor which I never take into account.
something to keep in
Definitely.
mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, before we jump into the book, I wanted to remind our viewers that we keep everything spoiler free until about 7:15 ish. And if you have any questions that you'd like us to ask Jennifer, you can put them in the chat and we will try to pull as many live questions as we can, although we have a plethora of advanced questions. Everyone's so excited.
Mm.
But before we jump into the book, we kind of have to talk about a little event that just happened, the King's coronation.
Oh,
I'm not
that thing.
sure that.
That thing.
So, for those that did not see you on Friends in Fiction this past week, can you tell us a little bit about what you thought of the coronation? Um, what moments surprised you? Was there
Yeah.
anything that you thought would happen that didn't happen? Things like that. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, let's
So the
talk about it.
So the thing with these traditional ceremonies or ceremonial events that associated with the British royal family is you can be pretty sure of what you're going to get. You know, they publish an order of
Mhm.
service ahead of time, but there's rarely anything that's going to make you fall out of your chair in terms of, well, I was not expecting that crazy thing to happen, right? And apart from, you know, nobody's going to be streaking up the aisle of Westminster Abbey, one hopes, right? But and part of that is, and part of it is there's a certain inflexibility, right? Which I think the king was trying. There were some really earnest efforts to bring it into the 21st century, bearing in mind kind of the weight of tradition that tends to kind of squash those efforts. But you're also looking at a ceremony. I've talked about this, you know, in some some writing I did before the coronation for the Globe and Mail newspaper here in Canada. And, a lot of people are of two minds, like whether they like the idea of a coronation in this day and age is, it is problematic, right? And the king is not the most popular member of the royal family. And so how do you weigh that against, wanting to watch and so on? And the point I made, which I hold by, and I think it was borne out by what we saw, is that the main parts of the coronation where they dig into kind of the ceremony that are relatively unchanged. And not just between now and 70 years ago when the queen was crowned, but for the past 1,000 years. So the language has changed over the years. Like, we originally would have been Latin, and it would have been Latin until relatively recently. And the exact phrases used have altered over time in terms of the specific oath that the king or queen makes when they are crowned, just before they are crowned, in fact. But the kind of the sentiments surrounding it and the intentions and just the overall weight of the ceremony it's 1,000 years old. And, like, again,
Yeah.
I'm a self-confessed history nerd, but how many things survive in modern society relatively unchanged for 1,000 years? Now that's both good and bad, right? Like,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, it's interesting, right? I was trying not to put any value judgments on it, but it was interesting. And so, and what was especially interesting is that with the coronation oath, where the king, among other things, he promises to uphold the church. That's a little problematic for a lot of people because Britain is a diverse society and Christianity is not the kind of the overriding sole faith there. And how do you make sure that people feel included? So that is problematic. But there's also a point in the coronation oath where the king promises to uphold the law and to ensure justice and mercy for all. Now, it kind of was one of these things that might have sped past people. Like, I was looking for it only because, again, I've just been obsessing over all of these things for the last 2 years. But if you go back 1,000 years, there are not many rulers who, once they had taken control, really cared one way or another about ordinary people, like the peasants, which would be my people back in the day until really very recently, were the peasants. Nobody cared. Just, you were there to kind of, work the land and behave yourself and not get in the way of what the king wanted to do. So the idea that the king was making a promise in return, so was given power or bestowed power by God back in those days, but then in return offered something back, I think is extraordinary. You definitely didn't see any of the Roman emperors promising to take care of ordinary people or having any interest in them. So there you see kind of the first glimmerings of what we might associate with democratic rule. It wasn't a democracy. We didn't see modern democracy emerge until much, much later. But that's kind of one of the earliest points where we see it. And I think it's fascinating to see
Yeah.
this endure for 1,000 years. So that's the nerd history side of things. What also struck me was how, they don't have to do much to Westminster Abbey and the surroundings to make it look fabulous, right? I mean,
Yeah.
some like, my local church happens to be very beautiful inside, but then, I remember the church that my husband and I got married in was kind of a suburban church that didn't really have a lot to, recommend it architecturally. And I remember thinking, oh, if we had the money, I would probably want to, put up tons of flowers and so on to kind of make it look, to zhush it up, as you would say. Westminster Abbey doesn't need any zhushing. And then you have the traditional robes, the fact that, and I think they handled the whole who's going to wear the super formal clothes and who's going to wear, regular going to a fancy wedding clothes. That was handled pretty nicely. Because I don't think anybody, it wouldn't have been very fair to, or again, there are lots of ordinary people, like regular people who'd done some extraordinary things in the pandemic, who were invited, which I thought was lovely. Like the 1953 coronation, it was all about, having the right connections and being part of this noble family, or that wealthy industrialist family, and ordinary people were really not there in great numbers. But the fact that you could go and just wear your nicest dress and a hat, as opposed to having to what are you, a ball gown, but not a ball gown, a long dress, but it just was. I get into that a little bit in Coronation Year when one of my characters goes to the coronation and it's like, what am I gonna wear? This is just crazy. And it was very, it just was very like visually, it was a feast for the eye, and the music was just incredible. Although I found it very irritating that like practically every channel that was showing the coronation had people yum, 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 on top of it. And I wanted to I want to listen to that beautiful soprano from South Africa, and you're talking.
Right. Right.
And we ended up, my girlfriends and I who were watching, we ended up watching CNN. That was the only channel where people didn't interrupt. So kudos to CNN, which I had not expected to be the channel. I thought
Yeah.
we'd tune into the BBC, and they kept blah, 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 blah. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that's, as you can see, I have lots of thoughts about the coronation, but the most moving moment for me was William kneeling before his father. I think a lot of people have echoed that.
Oh,
Um,
I
and
agree.
yeah,
That was definitely a moment.
yeah. One thing that I found interesting is a lot of people were perplexed by why the king and queen weren't smiling more and looking happier and so on. And I think in that sense, they were not realizing how the seriousness of the ceremony. It's not in some elements it feels a bit like a wedding day, a wedding ceremony, but in other elements it's very much like it's a really solemn ritual that is primarily religious, and it's not something you kind of are meant to be like the whole time through, right? You're supposed to be sitting and
right.
supposed to be very prayerful, and so yeah, and I think they were both actually quite nervous. Like it's a lot to get through, and
Yeah.
I don't know how I would have held up, and I'm 20 years younger than both of them.
Well,
So
that's the thing. It's it was demanding in addition to
Hmm.
being so, traditional and
yeah.
solemn. So yeah, I can't even
Yeah.
imagine having gone through
Yeah,
that.
and they cut it down in length quite considerably in all the elements, like both the procession and the ceremony, and even appearing on the balcony. Because I think again, awareness that the main participants were in their 70s, and let's not push things too much. Like having one of them keel over on the balcony would not have been great for anyone. So, although their popularity might have gone up,
Well, look,
but no, we do not
thank
wish
goodness.
any ill on anyone.
Well, thank goodness that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, Jennifer, that's really fascinating, and that leads us right into our main topic for tonight, which is talking about Coronation Year. And if I could, before you do a summary, I just wanted to tell you how struck that I was with this book because, of course, it was so timely, yet it was timeless. In 1953 London, for someone who's never been there, seems so close, but it was so vulnerable,
Mhm.
and it was just as its characters.
Yeah.
So it was wounded and recovering. And so I just thought it was a fascinating book. And I would love to hear your quick summary for those who haven't read it yet.
For
And
sure.
then we're going to spoilers. So
No
just
holds
to let
barred.
the group know we are past 7:15.
Yeah,
So
because I was yammering on about the coronation. So Coronation Year, which I had finished months before the Queen passed away. So the idea was that it would come out in the 70th anniversary of her coronation, not her Jubilee year, the year after. But that would be kind of the hook to talk about, oh, it's the 70th anniversary, and then there actually was a coronation, which is kind of a bittersweet thing to acknowledge. I started with the idea of what would it be like to be living in London in 1953? How had life changed in the years since my book, The Gown, which was set in 1947? Had things got better? They had. Was life back to normal? It wasn't. And and specifically, could the events of Coronation Day have an effect on like just a regular people who weren't associated with the royal family in any particular way? and then I kind of kind of zoned in on this one moment of standing in the street, because a lot of the footage, the newsreel footage, there's relatively little that you can watch the coronation itself, but there's so much footage of the Queen going by in that Gold State coach, waving and just looking. Just looking out over the crowd. I mean, it sits very high off the ground. And so she's looking down at people and she's waving, that hilarious royal wave they used to have.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, at some point they turned it this way, but it was still very much the scooping the air, scooping the air. And I wanted to know, what would it have been like for somebody to have stood on the pavement along the route and watched her go by? And could that in some way affect your life, beyond kind of having the story to tell your grandchildren, right? Which I think a lot of people who watch the coronation, who are standing in the streets of London, that's one of the main reasons you would go, is to say, I was part of this historic moment,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to tell my children and my grandchildren about this. And so that led me to thinking, okay, well, who's living along the coronation route? And as you can see here, I've got a map, which my friend Charisma Panchapakasan, it's just up there. You can see it's in the book, though. If you open the book, you can see the map of the coronation route, and which is the actual, it follows the exact route that was taken, both on the way to the Abbey and then afterwards. And I pored over that map, both historic maps and current maps, to see what was there. And what I discovered is very few homes. It's central London. There's businesses, there's public buildings, the government buildings, palaces, huge hotels, but not anywhere that an ordinary person might live. And so then that sent me back to the idea of hotels. And then it just struck me, well, what if this were a really little hotel? Kind of, one of those places. I always like staying at little hotels. Give me a place that has 10 rooms over a place with 1,000 rooms any day. I don't care how much, like if the big place has a spa and 14 restaurants and you name it. I just want the little place where they'll remember my name when I come through the door, right? And so what if this little hotel were on the route of the coronation? How might it affect them? And then I did more reading and I discovered that the hotel prices just went skyrocketed, because people were coming mostly from abroad and wanted to be, have a nice, rather than stand in the street, they wanted to look out their windows and so on. And so that led me to this place called the Blue Lion. I found a spot on the map that seemed like a good spot. It wasn't a hotel; it was a public house, which is still there. It's been there for decades. It's called the Sherlock Holmes. A lot of people I've talked to have been to the Sherlock Holmes. It's one of the more famous of London's pubs. And from its front door and its front windows, you have a wonderful view of the route. And you would have had you would have been able to see the Queen go by and have nobody really standing in front of you. It was just terrific. And
Wow.
so that was the first character, was the Blue Lion. And again, I invented it. Don't go to London and think you'll find it. It's not there. Please don't be mad at
We had
me. Um,
we had a lot of questions
yeah.
about that, so
Yeah,
I'm
no,
glad
you
that
can
you
go to the
clarified.
Sherlock Holmes, and it's a great pub, and they have yummy sandwiches and pub food, and my son tells me nice beer. I don't really like beer. Um, and so once I had the Blue Lion, then the next step was, well, who owns it? Who's the person who's in charge of it? And then and it just came to me that her name is Edie Howard. She's the last of her family, the last living descendant of Jacob Howard, who opened the hotel, then a coaching inn in 1560. And she's barely able to keep the place open. It's just been such a struggle for years and years. And she's kind of at her, this is her last kind of ditch. I like, she's down to practically nothing in savings, and one more calamity will sink her. And then the route is announced, and the route of the coronation typically changes. It's not a set route, right? How far they'll go. It's changed from coronation to coronation, and it goes past the hotel. And so in that moment, she thinks, well, maybe I'm saved. And so she's one of three characters. So I added two more. There's Stella Donati, who, if you happen to read my previous book, Our Darkest Night, she's a secondary character in there. And so she's a young Italian woman. She survived the Holocaust, and she's looking to make a fresh start. And she's a very talented photographer, and she's been hired by Picture Weekly magazine, which will be familiar to anybody who read The Gown, and also Goodnight from London. She's been hired as a photojournalist, and she's, again, as with everyone in this book, everyone in my post-war books, they're all trying to find a way to live with what they endured during the war, and not have it be this albatross dragging at them. And then the third character is Jamie Geddes, or Alexander James Geddes is his full name. Very, very talented artist who's been hired to paint a portrait of the Queen in her coach going past a particular building. The people who own the building want the moment commemorated. So the building happens to be opposite the Blue Lion. So he comes to live at the Blue Lion as he has a perfect view of the building, and he can do all his preparatory work. And the backstory for Jamie is the important points are kind of twofold. One, he's a war hero, and he was a bomb disposal officer in the war. One of the most harrowing, terrifying, demanding jobs anyone could have. And he was left with PTSD after the war, which he's managed well as best you can when there's no support. There's no question of therapy or medication or anything. You're just left to kind of grit your teeth and get on with it. And he's managed it pretty well, but it still intrudes. And then the other important thing to know about Jamie is that he's biracial in a country that really, at that point, and in many ways still does, regard itself as kind of universally white. And there's very little attention paid to the historic diversity of England. Not, again, in the little towns in the countryside. Yeah, they were pretty white and still are pretty white places. But you go to any of the big cities, historically, Britain has been a diverse country for a very long time. And I wanted to acknowledge that. I wanted to acknowledge and include the experiences of people like Jamie, who are born in the UK. He is British. I'm not saying English because he's from Scotland. And if I say English, my Scottish granny is going to come down from heaven and hit me with a bolt of lightning. He's Scottish, not English, but he's born in Britain, born and raised in Britain, and he's constantly being made to feel that he does not belong. The whole concept of othering, which is, I don't think, again, that's a concept that people like me who are white necessarily understand, without doing some work to try and understand. Nobody's ever made me feel like I don't belong. But I felt it was really important to include Jamie's experiences. And I hope I've got it right. I mean, my worldview is a somewhat narrow one, but I wanted to do justice to.
I feel like you did.
Thank you.
I really do.
Well,
And I come from a mixed background. I'm not necessarily I'm like I have everything. But I really appreciated that you included that, especially during that time frame, because we rarely hear about biracial characters during that time frame. And we might have, an African American character, but you rarely have them. And I just thought that was just like a little icing on the cake that was this book. So I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I had become aware, and I'm going to be honest and say I feel an acute awareness that my earlier books are very white books, and they do not necessarily represent. In fact, they do not represent the historical reality necessarily of a country that has always, or I mean always, but since the Middle Ages, you could find people from a very wide range of backgrounds living in the port cities and the big cities, because it's an island, right? People come to Britain and would end up, the sailors, they fall in love with someone and then stay, right? And then that's how you you kind of slowly, there were not big waves of immigration. Those were just starting to happen in the 1950s, beginning with what they call the Windrush generation of people coming from the West Indies. But it built and built, and I think the historical origins of this change in Britain's population, like you have to address it and include the people who are part of it, because I don't know, otherwise it's just wallpaper history, right? Which doesn't, like what's the point of being an historian if you can't represent to the best of your abilities what life really was like at a given time? And people like Jamie belonged. And I should also, so in the background, I'm so sorry, you're going to hear some barking because my puppy has decided she can't live without being in the room with me, and I'm just hoping my son hears. Takes her away.
That's okay.
That's why I've got the headphones on.
We love dogs, so
Yeah, well, she's a
Yes,
good
mine are
girl, but
outside my door too.
yeah, well, she's desperate. We played ball in the hall earlier about 5,000 times, and I thought I tuckered her out, and apparently I have not. So anyhow, I'm hoping, I apologize for any background noise.
Oh,
no
that's quite all
worries.
right. And Jennifer, you covered those sort of the main characters so well, but I was curious, which one of those characters, and we're going to get into depth with them some more, but which one was your favorite to write and explore? And for our book club members who are watching, who did you identify with most in the story?
Oh, sure. So the one who is most interesting, and I would say in some ways like it required the most work, was Jamie's character, because like I'm not a man, I'm not biracial, I'm not a veteran. None of those experiences are personal experiences. And so for the man, I have to admit, I just kind of imagine things. Just,
Hey,
I ran it
you're
past
a
my
writer.
husband, but yeah, that wasn't so, like, I feel as if men are represented pretty well generally. I didn't feel I had to really, really go out of
Yes.
my way. But certainly in terms of representing his ethnicity, I approached three separate friends of mine who I knew just from knowing them over the years had backgrounds. Like nobody's background is ever going to be just the same because everybody's different. But I wanted to approach friends who had, to some degree, an experience of having family that had at some point originated in the Indian subcontinent, whether from Pakistan, India, or Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka, and then had at some point their family had come either to England or Canada, but to a fairly white, somewhat kind of waspy, a place to live, and what that was like for them. And one of the friends, her parents actually were married in England in the late 1940s. She herself is at the very end of the family. She's siblings are much older. But when her parents got married, her dad was Indian, her mom was white, from Wales. And it was kind of a 9 days wonder in the little town where her mom was from. Like, and I would not repeat the language that was, it wasn't overtly racist in the newspaper article, but it was certainly nothing I would repeat. It just had
Hmm.
that, like, I don't know, it had that tone, right?
Tone.
And
Hmm.
never mind that her father was incredibly smart and able man, and was very successful and very handsome, I might add. And it just was kind of like, there's that sniffy tone, and then two other friends again who had that experience of family ending up in the UK in both cases, and then eventually coming here. And what is it like? And I just wanted to make sure, so they read and reread all the portions of the book that concern Jamie, and I just wanted to make sure that the tone was correct, not just the details. Anybody can get the details, but the tone has to be right? It has to be, at no point could I was so worried that I might come across as patronizing, or in
Oh,
some way inadvertently belittling Jamie when I sought to kind of elevate him, right? I mean, if I'm going to have a male character in the book who's going to be, the romantic hero, he's like I don't, they're not perfect, but they have to, I want somebody to, by the end of the book to say, oh, this is my best new book boyfriend. Like, clearly I'm adding Jamie to my list of imaginary people
He's my
I'm
hero.
ready to fall in love with. And
We have a lot of Jamie fans in the chat.
I'm so
That's
glad. Well,
overwhelming.
because
There's a lot of favorite characters.
I don't want him. Yeah, he can't be perfect. At one point, he was feeling a little too perfect, and I had to go back and kind of. But I just, there's something to be said for a man who is beautifully, and this will speak to the romance readers out there, a man who is a beautifully kind of a beta character. So he's not the guy striding into the room, just like, throwing out the pheromones and just everyone's choking to death on all the, oh my gosh, the alpha male is just taking over. What about a really nice guy who's thoughtful and sensitive and brave when he needs to be brave and smart when he needs to be smart and listens? He's a really good listener. I mean, he really was, in some ways he's
Yeah.
like my darling husband, but with extra things like knowing how to, again, spoiler, knowing how to defuse bombs, right? Which
Yes,
Yeah.
we're going to
is
get
like
to that
are
We're
really
for
definitely
amazing.
sure.
going to get to that. Well, before we get to that, I do want to read a comment from one of our book club members. She is a big fan of yours. And right now, she is recommending all of your books in the chat, and everyone is putting
Isn't
all
that
of your books
lovely?
on their TBR. So I want to make sure I read this comment and question from her. It's from Susan Seligman.
Oh, I love
And
Susan. Susan is the best. Susan, you are
isn't she?
honestly the best.
She says, I love this book as I love all of her books, but I do have a question. I've read all of your historical fiction books and loved them all. The time frames have been World War One, World War II, and the period immediately following World War II. For your future books, do you plan on staying in these periods or are you going to expand? Also, are you going to think about setting any stories in North America? No matter where you go, I will follow you. A
Oh,
sequel to The Gown and or Coronation Year would also
Mm.
be great.
Yeah, that is so kind. Yeah, the next book, it's interesting. I flip-flop, right? I'll have maybe two or three ideas and I go back and forth until one really sticks. And I think I've found the idea that's sticking. And I've been talking about it a little bit, and now I'm feeling anxious that I don't want to talk about it too much. But it'll be set in roughly the same time period as Coronation Year. I wish I could say more, but I feel like I have to have a few more talks with my editor and agent before I commit myself fully. Because I had another idea that I was working on, very, very different to all of this. And then sometimes I get to a certain point and I go, I think this has to go on the back burner and kind of I'll churn away in the back of my head for another year or so. And then sometimes there's just this urge, oh, this book is going to be great now. And I don't know what prompts it. It's just sometimes the sixth sense I have, which doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, Coronation Year, I had no notion, premonition, beyond obviously the queen was very elderly and not super, super robust in health, towards the end of her life. But I did not write it expecting that she would pass away before it was,
mm,
I had fully expected her to hit 100 like her mother. I was really hoping she would.
Yeah.
And so, that was just more thinking, oh, well, I just wanted to typically when I choose subjects for books, it's because I'm curious about what was life like for this group of people, or what was it like to be alive in this place at this time. Can I explore that? And in so doing, learn. Ultimately, these are exercises in me teaching myself a little bit more about periods of history that I feel like, oh, that's a little, with Our Darkest Night, I felt, oh, I don't really know enough about, gosh, Italy in the Second World War. And then of course we had this family story fall into my lap of my husband's late grandparents being involved in the resistance efforts, insofar as they sheltered Jews in their home.
wow.
And that was just and that kind of led me not just on an expedition to learn more for myself, but also for my children. I think this is a really important story that they can tell their children one day, and that happened in their family. So my nose leads me in different directions, and I'm saying, oh, this new book is set in blah blah. I may, 2 years from now, you may be reading something totally different. The only reason I don't write about North America, and it's not because, and Canadians, we tend to be sensitive about our national identity and our history. And I'm always saying this to my Canadian friends. I think Canadian history is fascinating. I really do. But I haven't studied it at the level that I then feel comfortable writing about it. The history, kind of the lapsed academic takes over there. I feel comfortable with British history because I have I have a doctorate in the period, and my doctoral studies focused on social history in the 1940s. So I really have this grounding that
Wow.
I'm already kind of at a certain level of knowledge when I go to write my books. I don't have to start from scratch. I did a little bit more than usual when I was writing Our Darkest Night, because Italian history was less well known to me. But in that case, I had the in-house expert known as my husband to translate things for me, to put me in touch with his family directly. When we went on a research trip to the area, which was right before COVID, like we just managed to get in there right before. I still can't believe how we managed that. And he did all the translating for me.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, he's also he's very resourceful in other ways too, like anything to do with aviation. He's the person I turn to ask, questions. Yeah, he's super helpful, I have to say, and a really good travel companion. He's great at
Oh,
carrying heavy
Awesome.
suitcases.
we
Oh,
all
that's
need
great.
that.
He does sound a lot like Jamie in terms of his resourcefulness.
Yeah.
I did want to go back. I don't want to let the night pass without kind of digging into some of the good stuff in
Yeah.
terms of being able to talk about spoilers. You already talked a little bit about, the relationship that developed between Jamie and Edie and how their love bloomed. But there was the big storyline of the mystery and who was trying to sabotage the Blue Lion.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to ask about that. You had a cast of characters, and several of them could have been the culprit.
Mhm.
Um, sending the threats to the newspapers and all of those shenanigans. How did you well, let me just ask a question for the chat too. Who did you guys think it was as you were reading through the story? Um, I will say I thought initially it was Mr. Bamford, which was
Mhm.
way off base. But tell us how you honed in on who the guilty party actually was. And was it that way from the beginning?
Yeah. So it was Ivor from the beginning. And because I kept coming back to this idea of Edie having been raised to think that she's the last of the Howards. You're the last of the Howards. That's what's being drummed into her head. It's only you. Everything's down to you, which has a twofold kind of purpose in the plot, which is one, to make her absolutely kind of it's as if she's been trained since childhood to think of this as her duty, and that there's no possible option for her. Not unlike, let's face it, the Queen was trained since she was a little girl. The now King was trained, Prince William, Prince George. I mean, the overriding principle that guides all of their lives is that you will spend your life in duty to this inheritance that you did not ask for, that was given to you. You have no choice in it, and I know people are like, oh, poor thing, like, oh, so to be a bazillionaire and have all this. But, there's also some really difficult sides to it. And so for all that Edie does own what is ostensibly a very valuable property, and to the outside world looks, successful business owner and so on. What very few people know is that it's been kind of draining the life out of her for years, and that it consumes her every waking moment, and that she feels there's no escape. But then I thought, well, what if? I mean, it seemed improbable to me that you would have a family that at some point, like, did nobody have siblings? Like, was it just only child, only child? But what if there were siblings? And what if at some point there was, a generation or two back, there was a falling out, there was, a grandparent who looked at the various kids and decided, no, this one is going to get everything. And especially with, these kind of laws of primogeniture where, it doesn't matter if there's an older sister who's more capable, she's going to get bypassed, and it's going to be the boy who gets it. And so that from the beginning, I thought that was an interesting thread, which you see played out in kind of royal chronicles, but in ordinary people's lives too. And so, and that kind of led, I mean, in fits and starts. Plotting things is agony for me, because I'm at happiest in the details, and the big kind of, the arc of the story is something
Yeah.
I try and figure out ahead of time, and then I always deviate from, and then I write myself into corners, and I have to go back again. It's like finding my way through a maze.
But the
But it's
visualization is gorgeous. I mean,
Yeah.
the scene setting.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
that's the part that's fun, to be honest. Like, I have friends who write, mysteries and thrillers and stuff. I just don't, I am so in awe of the way that they can just laser through, vroom, that's the plot. And meanwhile, I'm just like, oh, I don't know. Should there be tea on the menu, or should there be tea and coffee? Oh, and where I'm kind of doing the small strokes, and really the big stuff is what I need to concentrate on at the beginning. Because I'm always so keen to get into the nitty gritty research. But from the beginning, I knew it was Ivor. And the question was, and at one point, I will admit, I've admitted this a few times over the last few weeks, there was another level of plot where, in addition to it, the blue lion being at stake, there was a lost crown, which I still think, oh, maybe 10 years from now, you'll see a book from me about a lost crown. And in this iteration, it was, I had the idea, and this just came from me noodling around in his, various archives. There's I guess it was just during the Civil War, and they'd seized all the crown jewels, the parliamentarians, and the king had been beheaded, and the Oliver Cromwell was running the show, as it were. And there was they made a list of what the crown jewels encompassed, and the estimated value of everything, before they prized all the jewels out of the crowns and tossed them into the melting pot. Which, I mean, they're not people, they're things, but on the other hand, these were ancient. Some of the things that were destroyed were truly ancient, and even then, and they are irreplaceable. And one line of one of the inventories mentioned King, not Edward's crown, but King Alfred's crown. And that got me thinking, what if somehow the crown of Alfred the Great, even though he lived in a time there people were less likely to wear crowns, but what if some kind of very simple circlet of gold, of hammered gold, had survived and was in fact Alfred the Great's crown? And he lived in the mid 800s. What if that had survived? What if that had been rescued, and hadn't been melted down, and had somehow, through a whole series of various things, ended up buried in the cellar of the Blue Lion? And I still think if I'd had another 300 pages in the book, I probably could have included it. But you have a kind of a limit, before, after which it starts to get really expensive to print, from my publisher to print the book. So I have to confine myself to about 400 pages. And I couldn't, it was really muddling things, so I had to take it out. But I've kept all of that stuff, like, it's there, and maybe one day I'll write a mystery
Oh,
about King Alfred's crown. But that all
Uh-huh.
led me to a lot of the
you
stuff,
heard it here first, folks.
exactly, yeah. So the professor kind of burbling on about the scribe framing and the cellars and so on, was all of that, is some of that's a remnant, but it was I had to just kind of cast enough doubt on various characters. I don't want, I
Yeah.
personally felt that Ivor, just by token of clearly, like, being a bigot in every conceivable way. I mean, I was like, if he isn't the bad guy, then who could possibly be the bad guy?
You know,
You know,
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I did kind of, he was on my list to begin with, but then realistically, then I went to Bamford, and then I went to Thurlow, and then I went
yeah,
to Ivor, but well before the Cellar,
yeah,
which I hope we get to
Yeah.
talk about too. I'm not sure, but I know
Well, we
yeah,
Lisa
have a
needs to read
couple.
them.
We just have a couple of comments that a couple of Bamfords, but a lot of people said they never trusted Ivor the whole time. They didn't
yeah,
know why,
yeah,
but they
yeah,
just didn't. So we had a couple
yeah.
of those.
And I think it's
Yeah.
fine if people like are going, oh, that Ivor, but as long as nobody knows until the moment it happens what he's going to do. Like it's just to create a feeling of uncertainty. Everything he presented to Edie, you can see how she'd be hoodwinked. He's like
Hmm.
indispensable, and he works so hard, and he mostly says the right things. A few times she gets her back up because he's kind of being a little strange, but that feeling we all have. Well, okay,
Yeah.
being a little strange occasionally isn't a reason to think this person wants me to do me in. And
Yeah.
meanwhile, he's just been consumed by this feeling of it's avarice and greed, and
Agreed.
this
Yeah.
this yeah, it's just straight greed. Because as
Yeah.
Edie makes the point to him, if only once you had told me that you were my cousin, I would happily have shared everything with you.
Yeah.
Everything. She just like for her, it was this terrible burden to be the only person
Yeah.
left, right?
She
And
didn't know. Yeah.
yeah, and he never
Yeah.
tells her, and how she, and so but he gets the rest of his life to think about that while he's sitting in prison.
That's
Yeah.
And
right.
and has been sacked.
That's right. And I did want to quickly get to that scene. Well, I guess you'd say scene, that whole the unfolding of everything at the
Yeah.
end in the cellar where he's revealed as the evil person, and he's trying to do eat again. That was really gripping for me because I remember when Stella runs up the stairs, just to see what our
Yeah.
other book club members thought in the chat. When Stella runs up the stairs and she goes after Jamie, I'm like,
Yeah, yeah. And you're thinking, is
call
somebody going to pull her
911. And of
back?
Yeah.
course, there isn't a 911, but
I know.
There was
I was
no,
like, is
yeah,
she going
like
to use the phone in the office, or is she going to
yeah,
use which
yeah.
phone is she going to use?
Yeah, and what if he
Yeah.
hears her, and then how do you get out and run down the street? And is anybody even awake at this late hour? Like it's just, or early hour, to be honest. It's the wee hours of the morning. And I wanted there to be that pulse pounding kind of, oh my God, is like
it
what's gonna
was.
happen? And I knew from the beginning, like that's one of the reasons that Jamie did the work he did during the war is so that he can come to the rescue. But of course, with this terrible burden of the PTSD, this terrible, terrible claustrophobic panic of being in enclosed spaces after having been buried alive, and then having the aftermath be so dreadful, when he was back in the war, and so that because then it just ratchets up the stakes for him. And then we also get to see that this is bravery. So bravery is not just running into anything, like no big deal. True courage, the kind of courage that people are given medals for valor for, is knowing exactly what you're facing, being scared to death, right? Absolutely scared to death, knowing that you are probably going to die, but knowing that you must do this very, very difficult thing. That's the kind of valor that Jamie exhibits,
Yeah.
right? That he showed during the war, and a kind of a selflessness, that he has no. Well, he has a regard for his own well-being, but it's outpaced by his regard for Edie and the other people at the hotel. And that to me is true heroism, right? Is somebody, and you'll see that in all of the heroes in my books all have some element of romance, because romance is falling in love with people is part of life.
Yeah.
And
Right.
I refuse to be sniffy about it the way some people writing literary fiction will be sniffy about romance. That's part of life, right? And I should add that
It
also
is.
when men write romance in novels, include romantic threads, their books are not classified as romance. So there's a bit of
Right.
a disconnect, right? Which
Oh,
I find very
absolutely.
irritating. And that whole kind of kind of second tiering of romance. Let's look at what is dominating the bestseller lists right now, and it's romance. So
Exactly.
and that's my side spiel. But what was really fun with that final bit was, first of all, figuring out like how do you build a bomb, and not wanting to give you so much information that I'm inadvertently, but based on what people had available then and what somebody who
Yeah.
was not in the military might conceivably have access to. So then that involves a lot of me kind of going and kind of retroactively adding information to Ivor's character. So that's when he became someone from South Shields, which not incidentally is where my dad's family is from originally. And it's, that part of Northumberland, which is really Newcastle. South Shields is just one part of it. But that's people from there are called Geordies, and they're mining folks. That's my ancestors were coal miners, and so that then seemed conceivable that if Ivor were from that background, he could get his hands on some mining explosive, which would really be the only way you could get something that could do some damage. And for that, I retired entirely on my uncle Gray, who's a retired colonel in the Canadian forces, and just so smart about so many things. And so we went back and forth, and I would, because you can't just say, oh, the bomb sat there and he went and he clipped a wire. It has to be believable, right? And so he actually did some research for me. I rarely get anyone to do any research for me, but he knew where to look, and so he did the research on that, and told me basically how to assemble it and what Jamie would do, and he was super helpful. And then actually my other uncle, my uncle John, so my uncle Gray lives in Halifax on the East Coast, and my uncle John lives in Vancouver on the West Coast, and he's a photographer, taught photography for many years, and is a very, very well-known, very acclaimed photographer with a real interest in history. And so he ran me through what cameras were like in the 1950s, and uh, what kind of cameras staff photographers, photojournalists would use, and how film was developed at that time, which was, even I know how to develop film. I did photography courses in university, but it was different even then than it had been in the 50s. So all of this was just like, my brain was on fire for months,
Oh,
honestly,
wow.
writing this book, all the stuff I learned, and I held on to bits and pieces of it, and I've got my notes if ever I need more details on, how to use a speed graphic camera in the
If
mid
you
1950s.
want to make another bomb, there you go.
Yeah, I will say right out loud for the various security services that may be listening in,
That maybe
that I
listening to
have
the
no
internet.
intention of ever building a bomb to hurt other people ever. I am a law-abiding citizen, and would never do that. You really want to make that crystal clear, and that's why it's
Crystal
somewhat
clear.
vague. Yeah, yeah. And it's not like
Yes.
dynamite is not something your average person, thank goodness, can get their hands on.
Right. Thank
But
goodness.
and I hope I make it clear that you know building a bomb improperly can really land you in a lot of hot water with the
Yes.
authorities. So
Yeah, I
Well,
would
yeah.
imagine so.
we are close to our hour, but there's no way we can let you go without asking you about, our members have been chatting about this in the
Yeah.
chat, and they love that you had the queen come to the blue
I know.
line at the
After
end.
swearing up and down when I was on tour with the gown that I would never have the queen appear as a character in one of my books because it was too intrusive and I didn't feel it was right, and la la la. I thought about that a lot. And then I thought, like, it came down to I had to write an epilogue, and there's a bunch of scenarios, but I thought realistically, if this group of people had prevented such a disaster from happening, they absolutely would have received some kind of recognition from the Queen. And at one point I thought, do they go to Buckingham Palace and, an investiture of some kind? And I thought, no, no, no. The palace wasn't going to want to highlight this more than they had to. But I felt that the Queen, it felt plausible to me that a quiet visit, to have tea, which would be like the highest honor anyone at the hotel could imagine, that seemed appropriate. And so the way I kind of made sure that I wasn't overstepping things, was nothing that the Queen says is the kind of thing that you look at and go, well, clearly that's out of character. I tried to um, make, pretty much everything she says are variations on other things she had said in not similar situations. There's no knowledge of her having gone to tea with people who prevented a bomb from destroying Coronation Day. But in terms of how she would react in situations where she was sitting at a tea with someone. I do know people who did have tea with the Queen over the years in recognition of services that they'd done, usually by helping to plan royal visits and so on. And
Yeah.
she was a very funny lady in person and had a really quick wit, not a biting wit. She just there wasn't much that got past her. And so the
Hmm.
one little moment I allowed myself was when she talks about troublesome cousins. And she really is, I should add, I was not making a dig at Harry and Meghan or anyone in the current royal family, because this is all before, right? Like she had the
Right.
two children, but not the later two. This is 53. What
Yeah, I
I
didn't
think,
even think about
well, what
that.
I thought of,
Yeah, I didn't think of
she's
that
thinking
either.
about Elizabeth the First, who had, her
Hmm.
various cousins and siblings who made things really tough for her. That's, you know, on the surface, that's what she's talking about. But I think on another level, she's kind of acknowledging in a very indirect way, which would be the only way she would acknowledge it, the whole issue with the abdication and the Duke of Windsor and so on. And she's acknowledging that, when one inherits something, quite often there are other family members who can be like a little difficult. But I also wanted to present to the reader, above and beyond uh, the portrayal of the Queen on Coronation Day, I wanted them to be able to see her as the way the world saw her in 1953, which is this young, very beautiful, very glamorous figure. She became kind of, she settled into be kind of being a mom, and then this distant figure of the Queen very soon, after this. By the 60s, she's she wasn't actually middle-aged, but she looks middle-aged. But in this period, she still is this very young, glamorous figure. And I mean, she's, the pictures of her, people go on and on about how her sister was so bewitching and beautiful. And she was, but I think Elizabeth of the two was the more beautiful when they were young. There's just something, and she kept that. She was very pretty, and she had, apparently she had this complexion that you'd be standing there going like, I don't think you have any pores. Like, where are your pores? You have no pores, right? And very, very bright blue eyes, right? Which you can see in some photographs, like very, very bright blue eyes. And that she just was the kind of person who, when she was paying attention to you, I think probably everything else in the world fell away, and you found it quite transfixing. And I will just quickly say, a friend of mine, I don't want to give too many details, but a friend of mine recently met with the king in London, and this friend has an official role in the government, and said and this friend has also met any number of like famous, well-connected people, and is not somebody to be dazzled. And so when she met the king, she said she felt this just very strong feeling. Like, he was very personable, very warm, very charming. And she walked away with this overwhelming feeling of having made a very good friend. And she just said it was kind of, and again, the whole, you're in the palace and there's all these people, and everything's very kind of over the top in some ways, but then when you're alone with the king, you really are. There's just the two of you. You're sitting there, nobody's standing there listening to what you're saying. You're having a private talk with the king, and his attention is fully on you. And he was very, very engaging. So just, if I know a lot of people still find it very hard to forgive the king for all of that stuff,
Things.
but I try and kind of, I always say to my kids, it's just, it's so much easier to just try and go through life and accept people for the people there are today, and have kind of, hold it lightly. And that's something I borrowed from my sister. Just hold this lightly, and try and be the golden rule, like I want to treat other people with the same kindness that I would hope they would offer to me. But that's just I'm not telling everyone to forget it. I'm just saying, I think maybe he's not as terrible as some people are convinced he is. So,
I love the
Jennifer,
tone
I
of
have
voice,
to
how it
say that,
drops.
yeah, I have to say that we have two more quick things. I
sure,
know we're
sure.
a little
Anytime.
over,
I'm happy to stay.
but our book club members, as well as me and Brenda, we are so thankful that you joined us. And there's so many comments about the level of detail and the level of research, and they're just so grateful to get like
Thank you.
the behind the scenes and the little extra tidbits about the book, about the royal family. So we're so thankful that you took the time out
Oh,
tonight.
thank you. Honestly, I'm
Now,
really honored because, there's a lot of people writing a lot of really great books right now. I mean, you just open, just gosh, like, open the books pages of any of the big papers, and I'm kind of constantly, oh my gosh, like there's just a lot of great stuff. So being recognized in this way, this is really meaningful for me. And
Oh,
I love the Friends and Fiction ladies. All of them have been so good to
yeah.
me, and especially like I have to say, Mary Kay Andrews is like this guiding angel in my life. She
Oh,
was kind to me from the very beginning when I was you know, when my first book came out, and she said kind things about it publicly, and I remember just
oh,
practically fainting, like fainting. I
oh,
had her books on my shelf at home. I was like, oh, who is this super famous author who's actually read my little book? I just couldn't believe it. And
oh,
she's
and
very fond of you too.
yeah,
She's
well, her
very fond of
kindness, and
you
she and
yes.
too.
Patty, like all of them, but MKA has just been very good to me, and she is somebody who, if she does need a kidney anytime soon, I will come down to Atlanta and do all the tests. I'm just saying
Oh,
that
yay! That
publicly.
means I'll get to see you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I
I
wish
live
I
in
could have made
Atlanta.
it to Atlanta. We couldn't get the dates to line up with an event in Atlanta this
Oh,
time,
shucks.
but maybe
Oh,
next
Yeah.
book.
yeah. Well, one of the things that I was going to say, the statue of the queen behind you,
Yeah, yeah, here
there's been
she
a
is.
couple of comments about that in the chat. And I know you mentioned before we went live, you wanted to share about the cup behind you as well.
I
Yeah,
love
so
the
this is this
statue.
is
Yeah.
this is the one, and so her purse has a little photovoltaic thing, and so when it's been in the sun, the hand does a little
Oh
wave.
my God.
Isn't that cute? You can
That's
get them in
awesome.
multiple, like queen waving statue if you Google it. It's and there's multiple versions of her, but I like this one. I like the
Oh,
hat.
I love
And
it.
then this one here, this is my only piece of collectible Royals china, and that's so it's from
Wow.
1953, and you can see the E2R. And
Oh,
I've looked at
That's
a lot of
amazing.
collectible china. Some of it really does not look like her. I'll tell you that, right? Like you're kind of like, who is this woman? This is clearly not the queen. And then the other thing, I think a few people would have seen before, but might like a close-up look. So this is the embroidery that I did when I was
gorgeous.
doing the research for the gown, and I went to London. And just as a little factoid that you might be interested in, so a lot of people, while the coronation was on, were sending me messages saying, "Who is that woman in the teal-colored suit holding the sword? Who is it?" And it turns out it's Penny Mordaunt, who's the Lord. I think her official title is Lord something something of the council, but what she would have been in a previous age was the head of the Privy Council, which before Parliament held sway would effectively have been the kind of the political leader of Britain. Now it's a ceremonial role. So she was wearing this beautiful suit, and if anyone remembers, there was she had leaves that looked like ferns. I'm not sure what type of leaves they were, and they're embroidered on her hat and also on the lapels of her suit in gold work.
Oh,
That embroidery was done by the same women who taught me how to do this at an embroidery studio called Hand and Lock. And they also
Wow.
did a lot of the embroidery you saw, not on the Princess of Wales or the Queen's gowns. Those were done in-house at their couturier and by the Royal School of Needlework, but a lot of the ceremonial dress, all the insignia that had to be changed from ER to to CR, they did all that work. And so it was kind of neat. I have, my little connection of this embroidery that I did at Hand and Lock. And then on Coronation Day, there was more Hand and Lock embroidery to be seen everywhere. So.
Oh,
That's
that's amazing.
amazing.
Yeah, that's amazing. So, Jennifer, I know we've kept you longer, but we've really appreciated your time and love digging into Coronation Year. But before you go, we want to ask you, where can our book club members, if they want to get a signed copy of your book, a signed copy to gift, or whatever, where do they go?
So I have sent book plates. So for people down in Atlanta, there should be book plates still at Foxtail,
Oh,
and
cool.
but if you want a book plate, so it's hard. Like it's hard to get signed copies to people these days. And apart from some booksellers in Toronto and events I've been to where I've left like a Likely Story in Maryland has signed copies, and a handful of other places I've been. But the best way to, if you want kind of to know that the book plate is coming directly from me and definitely signed by me, is you can go to my website, which is jennifer-robson.com, and there's a thing at the top of the main page that says book plates, and you can request a book plate from me. And it depends on if I'm out of town, or then it sometimes takes a couple of weeks for me to plow through the requests, and it depends on if either of my children is around and willing to help me put stamps on envelopes and things. But I do, I've been trying to get them out pretty regularly, and so I sign it, and it comes with a little postcard as well, and it usually will take a few weeks to get to you, and then you can just pop it into your book. And I think most authors are offering them these days because, again, it's just so hard otherwise to leave signed copies, and fewer publishers are doing the tip-in sheets. I don't know, something to do, something economics, something paper shortage, la 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 la. I didn't really listen, but
Well,
this
that's
is my
okay.
way of getting around it.
You've provided a route for that, which readers
Yeah.
really appreciate.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's how we will
Yeah.
and
I
lost
should
my
add,
train of thought there for a moment.
you can
So
ask for
sorry
more
about
than
that.
one. Like on the form, it's set up and it only kind of lets you like put in the request, but you can also email me by my website and say, actually, I just sent the request and I like 3 or whatever for my various copies, and that's fine. Like there's no, I might like if you want 100, I might be, I'm not sure, but I don't really have that many, but a handful. If you want your backlist covered, I'm here to cover your backlist.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, again, Jennifer, thank you so much for
Oh,
joining us
thank you.
tonight. It was
Thank
just
you.
such a pleasure to talk about
Oh,
Coronation Year.
thank you, ladies. You've been
And
so kind to me. And I will pop into, obviously, can't do it when we're on air, but I'll pop into the chat. And if anybody has any further questions, I'll
Yes.
do my best to answer. I may have
Thank
to take
you.
my
There's a
doggy around the
lot.
block a few times just to work off the puppy energy.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I'll post a
There
picture
okay.
if I can
questions
of,
in the chat,
Bonnie
so thank you
being
for that.
patient. Yeah, you're very welcome.
Thanks so much,
Thank you,
Jennifer.
ladies.
Take care.
Good night.
Thanks.
Take
Okay,
care of
Good
that
bye-bye.
night.
pup. Bye. Ah, she was
Oh,
a
that was awesome.
delight.
She
I know.
was.
We could have had her book club discussion in like 4 sessions. It could have been like a course, a book club Coronation Year course. Like part 1, we're going to
Right.
talk about this. She is so smart and intelligent, and just the details and the research. I mean, it was just great. And guys, thanks for sticking in with us. We are really in the after show, and I want to make sure we get to this because I put it in the chat. I didn't get the chance to announce it at the beginning. I had technical difficulties, and we're in the after show, so I can tell the truth. I'm having lighting problems. Half my house doesn't have any power. So
Yeah,
it's,
Lisa.
you
Well,
know, I
you were
had to
amazingly
like,
poised.
I know, I was like, Lord, this is not happening tonight. But we're going to give away a copy of Coronation Year. So for those of you that are still with us, Brenda, do you have a question you want to ask?
I do. If you can monitor the chat for
I
the
sure will.
first correct response. And I
Okay.
will ask, tell me the name of in the novel of Stella's boss's name, his short name.
Stella's boss's name. Okay, there's a little bit of a delay, so
That's okay. We can
yeah, once the answers start coming in. Oop,
and
we have an answer. Our first answer is Michelle Marcus, and she says Kaz, which is the
that
correct
is
answer.
correct.
So,
Which you might
yay!
say, why, if you want a copy of the book, why would you ask a question about someone in the book? But everybody's read it, or they wouldn't be here this long. So
True. They might want to gift it to someone else. So,
that's right. That's
Michelle,
right.
DM one of us your address, although I believe we probably have it, but
We
still
probably
do
have
anyway.
it.
And we will get this out to you.
Yay!
Yay!
Congratulations, Michelle.
Yay! So coming up, we've got happy hour on May 25th at 7:30 p.m. with Ron Block, our gracious happy hour co-host, and we have a special guest that we confirmed that's pretty good. You guys are definitely going to want to tune in, and Ron has no idea.
We love to do that for Ron. And of course, our next book discussion will be June 19th with our own New York Times best-selling author of The Secret Book of Flora Lee. And we'll have a special guest that night too, also a surprise. So lots of stuff coming up. And I did want to say, do you have any tea left?
I do. I was sipping tea throughout the whole show. Normally, I don't drink during the show if I just have water or wine or whatever right here. But when I have tea, I have to drink it. So
And it's so comforting you have it like that. I did want to say this is somewhat the right vintage. This is the china that my mom bought my grandmother.
oh,
And
wow.
I think it would have been the 50s, maybe the 60s. And it was the kind where you bought one piece at a time. And
Wow.
so I inherited it, and this is one of the few times it gets to see the light of day. And I have my teapot back here, which you can't really see.
I love it. Well, I just have my bookish mug. I believe this was a Christmas gift.
I
I
love
think it
it.
was 2020 from the Fab Four. It's very, you see my lipstick print, sorry. It's very cool with a lot of classic books and gold trim. It's a beautiful mug. It's one of my favorites. So I decided to use this one.
And I must say, Lisa, fascinators become you, because that looks very lovely.
Well, thank you. You look very lovely as well. Maybe we'll have to go to the Kentucky Derby next year with our fascinators. Make that one.
That's right.
Make that
No
a
kidding.
trip.
I don't think you can see it. I have some feathers, but there they are. They're very muted.
It looks very elaborate. If you turn your head to the side, you can really see. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Now we really feel like models.
All right, my dogs are going crazy and there's no telling.
Yeah. Thank you guys. We love you guys. We'll see you for happy hour in a little over a week.
Yeah. Oh gosh, just a week. Yeah.
I know.
Take care. Happy reading, everybody. Bye-bye.
PB&J out.